What's happening, guys? How are you doing? This is Rob of Rule of Two Review. Welcome back, and let's talk a little bit about these quotes from Reggie about Nintendo competing with Sony and Microsoft. I guess I should clarify that it's not about Nintendo competing with Sony and Microsoft, but more about Nintendo not being competitors with those companies. That's the essence of what Reggie was quoted as saying recently about how he views Nintendo in the market and how he views Nintendo as competition with what Sony's doing with the PS4 and Microsoft is doing with the Xbox One. It's really interesting. It's a very curious quote, and it's a very curious kind of perspective, I think, on what Nintendo is, how they fit in the market, and really the way he and maybe Nintendo see themselves in the industry. Now, to be fair, before I read this quote and get into my sort of opinions on it, it's important to note that he's not really saying that this is necessarily Nintendo's perspective. This is definitely more about what Reggie seems to think and how he approaches what Nintendo is doing when looking at the entire landscape of the video game industry, and again, the two other console competitors, Sony and Microsoft. So this isn't about him saying that this is Nintendo's exact viewpoint and opinion on how they fit into the industry, and Sony and Microsoft, they're not important, they're not competitors, we don't care about them. That's definitely not what he was saying, and I think it was important that I kind of clarify that before I get into this. Now, I happen to not buy into this. I don't believe that this is necessarily the truth or the way of it as far as Nintendo being competitors or not competitors with Sony and Microsoft, and that's why this was interesting for me to talk about. But here is what he said, recently quoted when discussing this very idea. He was initially asked if he does see Sony and Microsoft as competitors with Nintendo, and he essentially said, quote, "I don't," and then he went on to say this: "All of the rest of that time is entertainment time. That's what I compete for, minute by minute. That time you spend surfing the web, watching a movie, watching a telecast of a conference, that's all entertainment time we're competing for. My competitive set is much bigger than my direct competitors in Sony and Microsoft. I compete for time. When I do that, I have to be creative and innovative in order to win that battle." So there's definitely a lot of interesting things going on in that quote, and it should also be noted that really the idea of Reggie stating that Nintendo doesn't see Sony and Microsoft as competitors really has been something that a lot of article headlines have been putting out there, obviously to get people interested in the quotes and see it as maybe a little bit more dramatic or aggressive as it really was, because within this quote, he even essentially references Sony and Microsoft as competitors. He says, "My competitive set is much bigger than my direct competitors in Sony and Microsoft." So strangely, in this quote, he refers to them as competitors, but then kind of the context of the quote around that one sentence does make it sound like he's less worried about what the Xbox or the PlayStation are doing, and he's trying to basically compete for time. It's an interesting perspective. It's an interesting phrasing I think he uses when kind of discussing Nintendo's approach, or how he sees Nintendo's approach, and maybe what he, as the president of Nintendo of America, is trying to achieve on a daily basis. So let me get back into the main kind of point and opinion that I wanted to share in this whole idea. When we break it down to the bare essentials, when we talk about this in reaction to a lot of those article headlines talking about Nintendo doesn't see Xbox and PlayStation as competitors, I have to say this. I think that there is no doubt that really, yes, Nintendo and Sony and Microsoft are all competing with each other. There is no doubt. And this is really kind of a fortuitous little situation that's come up here, because the video I made a couple of days ago was in reaction to the crazy news and rumor about Nintendo apparently planning some sort of upgraded version of the Switch next year in 2019. And when I discussed it in my video, I kind of laid out my personal sort of thesis or prediction that maybe Nintendo is aware that Sony and Microsoft are preparing new consoles, and one of the reasons, not the only one, okay, definitely not the only one, but one of the reasons they might consider upgrading the Switch and releasing something next year would be because they know that they have to have an answer to new, way more powerful hardware like a PlayStation 5 and a next Xbox. And to me, if there's any truth to that, again, that's only my theory, but I feel good about that theory. And so if there's any truth to this theory of mine, then that would further be proof that they acknowledge that there is competition from Sony and Microsoft. I think most logical thinking adults, as well as Reggie and Nintendo themselves, absolutely know that they can't ignore Sony and Microsoft, just like, as I said in that last video, Sony and Microsoft can't ignore Nintendo just as much as they can't ignore each other. Everyone, I think, really acknowledges and understands in the large landscape or sandbox that is the video game industry, especially the home console industry, that yes, Sony and Microsoft and even Nintendo are fighting in a lot of ways for the same dollar, the same mind share of the gamer, the same dollar from the gamer. That's why there's a lot of the same games across different consoles. That's why they all have their own individual properties and IPs, because that helps pull gaming time and gaming dollars away from all the individual consumers out there looking to buy and play stuff. I mean, that's literally why you have games on your gaming device, because you want people to use that device, not the ones that the other guys are making. And I guarantee you Reggie and Nintendo know that. So the idea of these quotes is a little bit strange. I think what it is Reggie trying to continue to sort of, I hesitate to use the word distance themselves from Sony and Microsoft, because I don't think that they necessarily want to distance themselves, but I think that they want to keep themselves separated, or further double down on Nintendo having its own sort of niche and carving out its own little market with what it does. And I think that that is 100% true. In fact, just because I love Sony and Microsoft doesn't mean that I don't have a reason why Nintendo is my favorite company even over Sony and Microsoft, and it's because Nintendo does unique things and innovative things, and they try different stuff, and they make games in a different way, and they make controllers and user interfaces in different ways, and that makes gaming on a Nintendo console always different and unique compared to Sony and Microsoft. And so I do think that it's possible to acknowledge how Nintendo is far more unique than the entire rest of the video game industry, including Sony and Microsoft. But just because they're unique doesn't mean that they're also not the same, you know? And I know that those may sound counterintuitive, but personally, I think that both can be true. And I'm sure that a lot of you guys can understand what I'm trying to say there. And so just because one company is weird or different than the others and they do different things doesn't mean they're not all fighting for the same thing. And like I've already said once today, that they are. And again, I think it's important to acknowledge that I absolutely believe that Reggie and Nintendo know this. They may like to say these kind of things to sort of put up the front, kind of puff up their chest about how unique they are and innovative and different, and, oh, we do things so differently, it doesn't matter what the PlayStation and Xbox does. We can just kind of do our own thing. And certainly there is some truth to that, as I just spent a couple of minutes explaining. But it's not that it's so true to the point that literally everyone can just ignore each other and go down their own paths, and no one company's success or game acquisitions or whatever are going to affect the other, because they certainly are. Everyone is going to affect the other. That's the way this thing works. And like I said, Nintendo and Reggie definitely know that. And in fact, if you want even more proof as to the fact that that's true and the fact that they absolutely know that it's true, just look at the fact that Nintendo is trying harder now more than ever to get third-party companies on board. If Nintendo didn't care about Sony and Microsoft and the larger kind of landscape of the gaming industry, and they were completely fine doing their own thing and not paying attention to the rest of the competition, then they wouldn't be trying to court companies like Rockstar and Bethesda and Ubisoft and whatnot. We wouldn't see this incredible and awesome third-party support happening for the Switch right now. Games like Dark Souls and Wolfenstein and LA Noire and Doom and, you know, so many other games, Octopath Traveler. There are so many great third-party games coming, and I firmly believe there are going to be so much more next year in 2019, and that is a Nintendo acknowledging that these other games and these other companies that aren't Nintendo's games and Nintendo's companies matter. And they would only do that if they realize that people, the gamer, the consumer, spending money and spending time playing games, want these things that are readily available always on the PlayStation and Xbox, and Nintendo wants to take those as well. They want to take those either away from Sony and Microsoft, or they want to have their hand in the same pot as Sony and Microsoft, which means that they're all competing, and Nintendo and Reggie must know that. I refuse to believe, despite these quotes and what I think Reggie was trying to say with them, I truly believe that they understand this. And so at the end of the day, are these quotes really a big deal? Do they really mean a lot? Is it really important what Reggie was saying or not trying to say? I mean, even though I just spent 15 minutes talking about it, honestly, I'm going to still say kind of no. This isn't a huge deal, and I don't think that these quotes even have that much of an impact. It obviously sparked a really interesting idea and conversation in me that I wanted to share with you guys, and certainly it's fun to discuss and dissect. But at the end of the day, no matter what Reggie was saying here, what he was trying to say, even if we're all misconstruing what he was trying to say or whatever, at the end of the day, this isn't that big of a deal. I mean, Nintendo truly could not see themselves as competitors with Sony and Microsoft, and I don't think it would make a difference. I don't think it would change what they're doing. I don't think it would change the course of the Switch or their business model or the hardware that they're planning to make after the Switch. It wouldn't really make a difference. Personally, I just happen to know that they really do understand Sony and Microsoft are their competition, and I think that that's going to be better long-term than if they were ignoring them, because that's the reason we might get some sort of improved Switch that could combat the release of a PlayStation 5 and an Xbox 2, and it's the reason we might see an even better console from them next, whenever they make the actual successor to the Switch, whether it's another portable hybrid or just a traditional home console doing something else weird and unique. The fact that I personally believe that they're seeing Sony and Microsoft as competitors means it's going to keep them on their toes, keep them always trying to do something new, and keep them always innovating. Because think about it, if they didn't see Sony and Microsoft as competitors, then they wouldn't try so hard to do unique things. We wouldn't have had great systems like the Wii and the Wii Remote. We wouldn't have the awesomeness that is the Switch. They literally made the Switch because it's different than what Sony and Microsoft are doing. That means they understand that they're competition, and that's a way for them to stand out as better, in their opinion, and also in my opinion, than the competition Sony and Microsoft. So everyone basically feeds off each other. No one can ignore anybody, and I believe all three companies absolutely understand this. And at the end of this 15-minute sort of ranty video, that's really kind of what I feel. That's my ultimate perspective here. So what do you guys think? What do you think about the quotes from Reggie, and what do you think about the idea of Nintendo being or not being a competitor to Sony and Microsoft? Personally, I think they're all competitors and they all know it, but maybe you have a different opinion here. So please discuss it below. That is it for me today. Thanks, of course, as always, for tuning in, guys. This is Rob of Rule of 2 Review, and I'll catch you next time on another video.